Thank you everybody for being here. We have a stellar cast for this opening event for Anti-Poverty Week. The topic is, does poverty exist in our community? I'm going to introduce our guests momentarily, but a few scene-setting or opening comments. I think the answer is yes, obviously it does. Figures from VCOSS yesterday showed that 1 in 7 Australians is living in poverty. That's defined as living below 50% of the median income, which is $400 a week, and it's a bit over $800 for a couple. That figure worryingly includes 1 in 6 of our children. These figures come at a time when we know that there are more than 100,000 Australians who are homeless on any given night, and that doesn't necessarily mean sleeping rough. In fact, most of those homeless people are not necessarily sleeping under a bridge. They're not, but they are not in a safe place. They're in their cars, they're couch surfing and the like. So that, I think, is a clear indicator of some of the issues we're dealing with. In dealing with those issues, I don't think it's particularly useful to be using ideological language and positioning ourselves on a left to right scale. I think that precise and concise language about the problems and about evidence-based solutions to them is a more helpful way to go, and that's what our panel is going to try and do today, I think. For example, to be anti-poverty is not to be anti-business. It's not an ideological issue. In fact, I would argue that one of the, if not the greatest forms of social justice is a job, and the greatest provider of jobs obviously is business, and so we'd be looking for policies that help business people employ other people. I think another important aspect is perspective. I've just spent 2 weeks working in Cambodia on issues associated with extreme poverty. Extreme poverty around the world has been halved in the last 20 years to about 1.1 billion, extreme poverty being defined as living on less than $1.25 US a day. So there is progress at that level too, but clearly there is a lot of poverty still around. So some of the clear issues we need to be dealing with are, to what extent is it continuing? What have been the trends? As John Daley from the Grattan Institute, I'll introduce him momentarily, pointed out in a recent speech, things have not been too bad in Australia in the last 10 years, depending on how you measure it. So we've got a lot to get through. Part of the context as well is the rise of social enterprise, which is a beautiful melange of business principles and social mission and entrepreneurship in our community that is providing passages from poverty to sustainability and prosperity to a growing number of people, particularly young people. Overlying all of this is the recent seminal book, Capitalism in the 21st Century, by French economist Thomas Piketty, who's pointed out some of the intergenerational and very long-term trends in wealth creation and wealth sharing and inequality. So we've got a lot to get through. Before we start, I shall introduce everybody. Emma King is the Chief Executive, and Emma's over on your far left, Chief Executive for the Victorian Council of Social Services, VCOSS, and as I said yesterday, ACOSS released some very important figures, and Emma is going to go through some of the indicators. She'll speak first. Lucy Adams is next to Emma. She's the Manager and Principal Lawyer of Justice Connect Homeless Law. She's an expert in poverty law. And Lucy recently travelled to the US, Canada and Europe as part of a Churchill Fellowship looking at the criminalisation of that issue I mentioned a moment ago, homelessness. Michaela Novak, as I mentioned, is here from the Institute of Public Affairs. Her research interests include an assessment of inequality issues from a classically liberal perspective. And John Daley, as I mentioned earlier, is the inaugural Chief Executive of the Melbourne-based but nationally focused Grattan Institute. The Grattan Institute provides independent, rigorous and practical solutions to Australia's most pressing public policy issues. The four of them are going to start with a brief outline of their views on the question, does poverty exist in Australia? Then we're going to have a robust conversation, and then it's going to be over to you. If we could start, Emma, please, with you.
Thank you, Michael. I wanted to start in a slightly different way by telling you a story about a little boy called Ben. Ben's 3 years old. Ben's dad was murdered. His mother suffers from alcohol addiction. She's had violent partners. She's had a chaotic lifestyle. Ben and his mum have had nowhere safe and nowhere stable to live, and their lifestyle can best be described as transient. Ben's mum hasn't really interacted with him. He's been regularly left on his own or to the side, and he's a little boy who has suffered enormous neglect. Ben's recently been taken into foster care. His foster mum has witnessed him picking at his skin until it bleeds. He has terrible nightmares, he doesn't speak, and he's entirely withdrawn. We know that the architecture of our brains is sculpted by very early experiences, and this determines the development of our neural circuits. So the plasticity of our brain does decrease over time and brain circuits stabilise, so it's much harder to alter later. There's a constant pruning of circuits that aren't used, so there's a component here of use it or lose it, basically. And through suffering extreme poverty, chronic neglect, witnessing substance abuse and family violence, among other things, the development of Ben's brain has been disrupted. He's constantly suffered from toxic stress. When you look at this picture here, what you'll see is a picture of a normal 3-year-old brain, one term normal, and then you'll see a picture of a brain of a child that suffered neglect, and that's similar to what Ben's brain, we believe, would look like. So it's quite an extraordinary space to start. When we look at the way synapses in the brain develop, we know that they're created with astonishing speed in the first 3 years of life. And then for the rest of the first decade, children's brain have twice as many synapses as adult brains. And you'll see there the difference from at birth, the development around 6 years of age, and then at 14 years of age, you'll see them start to come back because, again, that use it or lose it principle is coming in. So the damage to Ben's brain started when he was in utero. He didn't have an adult really there to love him, to be with him, let alone to care for him, to sing to him and to read to him. And where there's no interaction or positive interaction between children and caregivers, this cements the brain development of children. So the relationship a young child has with their caregivers, it literally sculpts the brain and it determines the development of circuits. So having somewhere safe and secure to live, having healthy relationships and having adequate nutrition are vital. And because of Ben's experience by age 3, Ben actually doesn't speak yet. And the research shows that there's a direct correlation between this and the likelihood that he's actually not going to be able to read by the time he gets to grade 3 at school. If you look there, it's just a quick slide on vocabulary growth. You'll see there's a very distinct difference between children who come from low, medium and upper SES levels in terms of their vocabulary growth as they progress. What we do know is that we know that early parenting support is crucial. We know that interaction between babies and parents are crucial. And we also know that chronic neglect in the early years creates lifelong disadvantage. So this is social, emotional, health and economic. Intervening early is critical and it makes a crucial difference. And early intervention is going to maximise benefits. So this is true whether it relates to early childhood, whether it relates to health, whether it relates to housing, etc. Yet, where do we position our expenditure? When we look at the return on investment, if you look at the slide here around the difference in return of investment around preschool programs, then at school, then at job training, you'll see the exponential difference when we look at preschool there. So the return on $1 to $8 in terms of when we intervene early. So we know that poverty and inequality are growing, and what are the long-term implications for us? The statistics released through the VCOSS report show that 13.9% of all Victorians live below the poverty line. That is, they live below $400 per week. They've still got to take their costs for housing out of that. They've got to take costs for fuel, costs for transport, costs for health, etc. out of that. 17.7% of all children live below the poverty line. 24% of Australian households experience housing stress. So 1 in Australian families with dependent children is jobless. So does poverty exist? It most absolutely does. And the challenge from here is how do we turn this around? So one of the key challenges for us and for governments of the future, and as Michael quite rightly said, this isn't really about a fight between left and right, it's actually about doing what's right. So we need strong policies that invest and intervene early, to move beyond election terms to robust, strong policies and sound expenditure that's a true investment in our communities. And I think it's imperative on all of us to call for that and to call for what's better. So when we look at Ben and we look at his traumatic, and I acknowledge that it's an extreme example to look at a little boy whose dad was murdered, but can I say, when I was looking at the story in the first instance and I was thinking I could, create something that would tell a same story, when I started to look at case studies, they were all worse than what I was actually looking to try and create. great. But what we do know is that the community sector organisations that work at the front line, and this is a true example of one that was taken from one of our community sector organisations, they've got in as early as they possibly can, they're providing foster support, they're looking to make a difference. So we know we need long, strategic investments that truly goes beyond election terms and truly invests in our community. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Emma. Lucy, would you like to, you can have the lectern or you can stay there. Absolutely, please, over to you, Lucy Adams.
Thanks, Michael. So I think when we talk about poverty and we talk about this idea of life being precarious, it can sometimes be a bit abstract. It's hard to get a good grasp on what it actually means to be poor, and it's stories like the one Emma just told that really identify what it can mean day to day, how it can impact on your life and how it can impact on the life of your kids. And a woman that we recently assisted through our Women's Homelessness Prevention Project, I think also brings some of these issues to life. So she's 38 years old. She's a carer for 5 children. She's living in private rental. She's reliant on Centrelink, and her rent is $1,600 a month, and that is over 50% of her monthly income. So from a definitional point of view, she's in severe housing stress, but from a practical day-to-day point of view, it's really tough to make ends meet. She's been homeless before when she had to leave her family home as a result of violence as a young person, and her recent relationship has also ended, and violence was also a part of that relationship. Of her 5 kids, 2 have learning difficulties, and one of them is her sister's child who isn't able to live as part of that household. So what we see at the end of the day is it's pretty tough to get by, but it's also really hard. There's not a lot of room to move if things come off track. So recently she was hospitalised with pneumonia, and a lot of the supports that you and I would turn to, so your social supports, financial, your familial supports, they weren't there for her. So she's in hospital, there is no one to pick up the kids from daycare, and they have to spend the night there. In addition to having pretty distressed young kids, she also comes away from it with a $750 debt for the daycare. And she has to make a choice. She pays that debt instead of her rent. It wasn't possible to pay both. And before she knows it, it's been through VCAT and the police have a warrant to change the locks on her property. So at that point, this woman and her 5 kids are facing the very real prospect of entering the ranks of 22,000 Victorians who are experiencing homelessness. And I think that kind of situation, when we talk about poverty and we talk about life being precarious, that is what we're talking about. We're talking about people who are walking a tightrope between getting by and slipping into situations of hardship that a lot of us in the room would find quite difficult to comprehend. So it is things like sleeping in the car with your kids, families couch surfing, things that make it really difficult to get a job or to hold on to the job that you have. They make it difficult to keep your kids in school, and they make it very difficult to take care of your own mental and physical well-being. At Homeless Law, we assist 400 clients every year who are either already experiencing homelessness or at the brink of slipping into homelessness. Over 100 of those people are dealing with fines and charges for what we call public space offences, and that's things like begging, being drunk in a public place, public transport offences, all things you're much more likely to be doing in public if you don't have a private place to carry out your private life. And this trend of using the criminal justice system and law enforcement to tackle poverty and to tackle homelessness is often referred to as the criminalisation of homelessness. It has a harsh and heavy impact on the most struggling members of our community. It entrenches poverty and it further marginalises people. To give you a sense, a fine for being drunk in public is $600, and if you're relying on Newstart, your weekly income is $250. So if you're battling with alcohol use and you're homeless, you're facing the possibility of getting a fine that is 240% of your weekly income. And that's if you just get one. So we see clients who are dealing with thousands of dollars of these fines. They do become overwhelming and they do become quite paralysing in the face of trying to exit homelessness. So I think it's these kinds of examples and these kinds of issues that really cause us to stop and reflect on the way we as a community are dealing with homelessness and with very visible hardship and poverty in our communities. I think it is time for us to have a rethink, and I think conversations like this are a very good starting point.
Thank you, Lucy. I think both of you have touched on one of the most important sort of measures that we'll come to in our discussion of a civilised community, and that is how you treat those who are most in need. Michaela Novak is, as I mentioned, a senior fellow at the Institute of Public Affairs. Michaela, over to you.
Well, it's a great pleasure for me to be here. I want to sort of start out by trying to sort of frame the domestic discussion about income and wealth dispersal, about poverty in a sort of much broader perspective. We need to sort of bear in mind, without obviously discounting the power of the messages that our previous speakers have already mentioned, the fact that 20% of the world's population, or 1.2 billion people, still live on less than $1 a day. That's obviously $365 per annum. And for comparison purposes, the New Start payment provides single Australians recipients $35 a day. That's over $13,000 per annum. Now, I think too many Australian inequality commentators also tend to forget that so many fellow members of our species are actually deprived of what I call the two great externalities for human flourishing, and that's clean water and electricity. It's estimated that 1 billion people cannot access clean water around the world, and 1.3 billion people cannot access electricity. So for mine, the heart of the issues at play are not necessarily about income and wealth dispersal within the arbitrary confines of a political nation state, but to clarify that, I'd be very critical of income and wealth dispersal which is engendered as a result of, let's say, the dispensation of crony capitalistic favours, the provision of public sector jobs, and the doling out of welfare to state transfers by government, especially if they lock people in to a long-term state of dependency. I think the bigger question to ask is whether the poorest among us are moving closer to having enough to live in dignity and to participate in a democracy. And in the main, I think they are, both domestically and abroad. To quote the American economist Deirdre McCloskey, my friend Deirdre, she says this: the poor have gas heating, cars, smallpox vaccinations, indoor plumbing, cheap travel, rights for women, low child mortality, adequate nutrition, taller bodies, doubled life expectancy, schooling, newspapers, a vote, a shot at university, and respect. Now, saying all that, does poverty exist in our community? Yes, of course, in a relative sense, and it seems also in some senses in an absolute sense, but probably less so over time. We've already sort of touched upon the extent of homelessness in Australia, so 6,000 people, the ABS estimate, are sleeping rough nationally, and anecdotally it is suggested that the number of homeless people in Melbourne are on the rise. So from my perspective, which is a classically liberal sort of economic and social perspective, what would we want to do about that? Well, I would argue that we'd want to liberalise land use regulations, to get rid of a lot of the sort of zoning and other sort of planning permits and the like, which actually prevent people, homeless people, being able to access very, very cheap land. Intrinsically, it is cheap, and we live in a vast continent, and the cost of constructing housing is becoming dirt cheap as well. I read recently on social media you can actually build a house for $4,000. I mean, it's dirt cheap, so you want to liberalise land use regulations to enable homeless people to have a shelter, a roof over their heads. I think from my perspective as well, you want to have a serious look at labour market regulations, including the minimum wage and occupational licensing. There'll be some research that the IPA will release, hopefully this week, which suggests that for most people, in the main, things are getting pretty much better all the time when you sort of look at a very long-run perspective, and that's the way an economist like me would actually tend to look at things. So over the course of the last few decades, 100 years, 150 years, social and economic conditions for most people are getting better all the time. But that said, there are still people among us who suffer disadvantage, and the key question is, how do we deal with it? I think the best way is through an enlargement of enterprise and an exercise of creativity and freedom that way. Thank you so much.
There's a lot there to come back to, Michaela, and we will after we hear from another big picture thinker, John Daley, the inaugural Chief Executive of the Grattan Institute. Thank you, John.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the chance to be here, and thank you everyone for coming. I think it's always helpful in discussions like this to distinguish between two different kinds of problems. One is a problem about inequality. In general, some people have more than others. And one is a question about the absolute position of people towards the bottom, what we often think of as poverty, although we don't often define poverty like that. In other words, to what extent do people at the bottom of our society have the opportunity to live lives that are worth living? To what extent can they get a reasonable education? To what extent can they get ahead in life? To what extent can they have children? Really basic things that clearly matter a lot to living a life that has value. To be honest, that's one of the issues I have with any definition of poverty which looks at it as a percentage of the median wage, is essentially measuring inequality. It's not really measuring to what extent do we have some people in our society who are really locked out of some of the basic things that go towards a valuable life. So I just want to start with that distinction. Now that said, there are clearly people in our society who don't have the opportunities, the basic opportunities you need to live a life worth living. The most beautiful, perhaps least beautiful illustration of this recently, some people who've done some lovely analysis in the US looking at essentially death rates amongst children aged 0 to 1. And they are much higher for children born to poor parents. Now, it doesn't matter whether you think about that as inequality of outcomes or inequality of opportunity. Either way, those children didn't wind up with much of a chance in life. And that's clearly a problem, and that's clearly the kind of thing that we need to focus on first. And of course, when you look at Australian statistics, and it doesn't matter exactly how you define them, any way you look at it, people born into houses with relatively lower incomes tend to inherit low levels of education, they tend to inherit higher levels of violence, and they tend to inherit higher levels of joblessness. So clearly, we have problems, however you choose to define them. As Julie was saying, the good news is that over the long run, and even over the 10 years, which is the medium term, things are clearly heading in the right direction. If you look at real incomes amongst households in the bottom 20% in Australia, those incomes have lifted quite materially over the last 10 years. And this is a good illustration of where this distinction between absolute poverty and relativities applies. It is true that the rich have done slightly better than the poor over the last 10 years, but the bottom line is that all boats have lifted. And I'd rather be in a world in which all boats were lifting rather than a world in which some boats are not lifting or indeed are going backwards. And the other good news, of course, is that Australia has a very tightly targeted welfare system. If you look at other countries in the OECD, we give as much as most countries to people in the bottom 20%, and then very little in the way of welfare payments to people in the top 80%. So we have an extremely targeted welfare system, which is by and large making a difference. On the other hand, there are clearly some problems. If you move away from definitions of poverty as being percentages of incomes, of median incomes, and instead look at the extent to which households can invite people around to dinner once a month, the extent to which they can essentially pay the bills, pay the basic electricity bills. There are clearly a group of households in Australia that are doing it very, very tough indeed, particular households that are on New Start and households that are on old age pensions but who do not own their own house. Those two kinds of households, by and large, in quite a lot of trouble. So that's problem number one. Problem number two that I would point to is something we don't talk about very much, which is social connection. One of the biggest drivers of well-being, whether people have a happy life or not, either in the short run or in the long run, is essentially whether they are connected to other people. And we know that households on very low incomes tend to have much less social connection, although interestingly, it is far from a one-to-one relationship. There are households with low incomes who are very socially connected, by and large die happy. There are households with very high incomes who are not socially connected, by and large die very unhappy. But overall, of course, households on low incomes, less socially connected, and it seems to be a really big driver of whether they live lives worth living. So what can we do about it? A couple of things. One is around welfare adequacy. As I said, there is clearly a problem for households on New Start. There is clearly a problem for households on age pensions who do not own their own house. Those kind of households tend to be doing it very tough. And then in addition, partly because our welfare system is so targeted, there are real disincentives to some of those households participating in the workforce, particularly women who have children and who find themselves often in a situation in which if they go and start working or if they increase their hours of work, they essentially go backwards by the time they have paid for childcare, lost welfare benefits because they're earning money and have paid taxes. So there's a real issue, I would suggest, in terms of looking at welfare adequacy right at the bottom. Secondly, there is clearly issues with education. As Emma pointed out, the things that matter most are around early intervention for children from low SES households. The catch, of course, is that we can advocate first best policy, which is let's spend a lot more money on early childhood for our low-income households. In real life, however, that often gets translated through politics into we're going to spend a lot of money on early childhood for all households, many of whom it doesn't make a lot of difference, certainly doesn't pay back very fast, and actually we wind up then seeing children from low SES households not participating anyhow. So we wind up with third best policy. We spend a lot of money on something that doesn't make a lot of difference. And that's the real challenge in that area, is finding a way through the politics so that we can wind up spending a lot more money on the early childhood education of children that really need it and for whom it will really make a big difference. The third issue, which I've already adverted to, is around social connection. Here, one of the biggest problems is that we've simply never focused on this as a problem. Our understanding of what results in some households having lots of social connections and some households having very few social connections, short answer is we don't really know. And some of the best evidence we have for programs that have actually really made a difference were things where the programs weren't even trying to do that in the first place. So I'd suggest that's an area where government and social science is really in its infancy. We don't know what makes a big difference. We do know that having a job helps a lot. We do know, obviously, that having strong family relationships helps a lot. But what can government do that will make a difference? We don't, by and large, have much of an idea. And then finally, as Michaela was pointing out, obviously the extent to which people work does make a really big difference. There are very few households that are working that wind up with no opportunities at all. It's, as I said, the households that seem to be the most vulnerable are those that are unemployed. And there, trying to work out what government can do that will make a difference is, again, clearly really important. We do know that some job programs make a difference. We do know that minimum wages can make a difference, particularly for younger people. And indeed, one of the reasons why Australia has much lower rates of junior joblessness amongst young people is essentially because we have, in effect, much lower minimum wages than many other OECD countries, which have essentially created this trap that makes it very hard for young people to get jobs. Those are some of the things that governments can do. I think what we'd probably all agree on is These are difficult problems. They are problems that matter a lot, but they're problems worth trying to solve.
John, thank you. There's so much in what you've just said and what the others have said, and one of the things that comes out resoundingly, I think, is the notion that a premise of getting the change that we're seeking is equality of opportunity. I note in passing that we don't know, well, you're talking about the importance of connection as well, and one thing we do know is that loneliness is as big a risk to health as smoking. It's cutting more than a decade off people's lives if they're lonely, so we can see some very important things going on there. Emma, if I can throw over to you on the question, or in the context of equality of opportunity, and also with what John's saying about the figures showing that we do have a very targeted welfare system, but he's pointing to perhaps the inadequacy of the payments that are being made to those in need. In the context of equality of opportunity and our welfare system, do you think things are heading in the right direction?
No, in one word, no, I don't. And I think one of the key things to point out at the moment, when we look at the targeted welfare system that we have, first of all, we're seeing New Start figures at $36 a day. I think I challenge anyone sitting in here to try and survive on $36 a day. I think it's totally unrealistic. The other thing I did just want to touch on as well, though, is that we do have things such as youth unemployment that are skyrocketing at the moment. So in Victoria, when we look at the first 6 months of this year, youth unemployment is sitting at 14.7%. So we're seeing, if we're wanting to look at equality of opportunity and making sure that we've got giving young people a very best chance to get that toehold into the workplace, etc., we've got to really look at how we assist young people get into work. And in looking at the federal government budget proposals of leaving young people without an income for 6 months of every year, really I think that's going to have the opposite impact. So I did just want to touch on the federal government budget proposals because they're entirely targeted at those who are vulnerable, those who are disadvantaged and those who are in poverty, and it really will shift a whole new cohort, I think, into that group as well. In terms of equality of opportunity, the VCOSS report that was released yesterday shows that we've got, and I take the point around you can measure this in different ways, and there's a whole different ways that we can slice it, but at the end of the day, we've got 13.9% of all Victorians that are living below the poverty line. So that's 650,000 people who have less than $400 per week, and out of that $400 per week, they've got to take their housing, they've got to take their food, they've got to take their health costs, and they've got to take their education costs. So while some other, if you like, you can say, well, incomes have increased, the reality is the cost of housing has increased considerably more than that, the cost of health has increased considerably more than that, the cost of education has increased considerably more than that. So when we look at equality of opportunity, there is an equality of opportunity there for all. It does come back to needing early intervention, etc. The other thing I wanted to touch on as well was looking at rural and regional Victoria, because the other highlight, if you like, or low light, depending on how you look at it, and looking at the VCOSS data, was it was showing that the impact of those who are living in poverty on the measure of looking at that, the particular salary figure. If you calculate it at 60% of median income, there's 28.8% of people living in regional Victoria who are at risk of poverty. And we know that, again, that comes down to access to jobs, it comes down to access to public transport, access to services, access to health, etc. as well. So we are seeing different pictures in different parts of Victoria, and looking at rural and regional Victoria and looking at growth corridors, we're seeing a real concentration of those issues around poverty, and we're seeing new groups of people come and access emergency services, so basic material relief like food, for the very first time. They're turning up to our members and looking, in terms of our members who are here, you'll know you've got people knocking on your door for the first time saying, we need help, and we never thought we would be in this position. We thought we were fine. We bought a house out in the growth corridors. Things were looking good, but actually I work in manufacturing and I lost my job, and I can't see how I'm going to pick up my next round of employment. So slightly long answer to your question, but hopefully that picked up the key points.
No, great answer. I want to pick up on something and throw it to the whole panel, the toehold in the market that you talked about, and we've talked, and I've mentioned, social justice flowing from employment. Yes. Minimum wage has been discussed. What about a youth wage? Can I start with you, Emma, just quickly? A precise policy question. Is there social justice arguments able to be, are there social justice arguments for having a youth wage that would allow more of those people in, but at a lower level? And for those that can't, would there be a similar argument for raising some of those minimum welfare payments?
There actually is in awards and agreements staggered rates, as there is anyway, but the reality is it doesn't cost a young person less to live than anyone else. So if you're looking at, if I'm a young person and I'm 19 and I've left home and I need to rent my house, it doesn't cost me less than the person next to me that might be older. You could bring a whole lot of other caveats into that in terms of do you have children, etc. But I know one of the key things that we emphasise when we're engaged in the McClure review and the McClure report, where they are contemplating a lower sort of new start allowances, etc., for young people, was to say, don't do it. Adequacy of payment, and particularly around adequacy of basic welfare payments, is really critical, and you can't assume that young people need less. So, I take your point, we need to find new ways to get young people into the market. A lot of that is looking at the type of work that's available, and we're seeing a real shift from the traditional measures of employment, such as manufacturing, etc., into service areas. I think some of the key things we need to look at is vocational education and training, opportunities for those that have not finished Year 12, because ideally, of course, we want to keep students at school until they're in Year 12. I was a secondary teacher many years ago. At that point, kids could probably finish at Year 10 and find their way into an apprenticeship. The world has changed, and a lot of those apprenticeships simply don't exist anymore. We're moving into much more service-type industries. The nature of employment in Victoria and in Australia is changing as well. So it's really looking at, I think, a broader piece here, and I think to simply pull out youth wages would really be ignoring the broader picture. And I don't think that paying people... When I look at some of the other examples that often we speak about overseas, I'm not sure that they're examples that we really want to aspire to.
Lucy, what do you think?
Look, in terms of the income needed by young people, I guess our main area of interest is looking at people slipping into homelessness. And I think we can pretty unequivocally say if the budget measures that are proposed were introduced and if that income wasn't available to young people, there would be a pretty astronomical and alarming rise in homelessness, because people wouldn't be able to keep up with their rents and they have nowhere to move if that's the case.
Michaela, and perhaps more broadly than homelessness, but obviously very important, but do you think that a market-clearing youth wage would be a more socially just outcome than the status quo?
Noting in general that the non-youth minimum wage is relatively high across the OECD, and we have therefore a youth sub-minimum wage which is somewhat below that, recognising that there is a cost to employment. I'm probably more concerned about the availability of opportunity, and we talk about equality of opportunity. I'm thinking about getting rid of a whole sort of suite of sort of product and labour market and other sort of regulations. Occupational licensing is a sort of particular sort of bugbear from that perspective. If you're a young person, you need some sort of entry-level occupation to make a sort of foothold into the labour market and then build up your skills from there for the rest of your lifetime. If you're requiring very extensive, very time-consuming, expensive qualifications, that might actually sort of stymie your aspirations in terms of getting a foothold very early. So I'd sort of, in terms of answering the question, I actually want to transcend that particular issue. I don't have a problem with a youth sub-minimum wage, recognising these are entry-level jobs and labour is a cost, that wages are a cost to employment, but let's just think more broadly about deregulating and so really unleashing creativity and enterprise for young people.
John, do you want to talk a little bit more about that issue, and also a little bit more about the issue you were going to with the level of those targeted payments?
Yeah, thank you. So in terms of youth unemployment is higher than the unemployment rate generally for the population in every country in the world, I think. That's not wildly surprising. And Jeff Borland at the University of Melbourne has done some very good work essentially showing that the recent rise in youth unemployment in Australia is essentially completely commensurate with the rise in unemployment more generally. So it's not a particular youth issue, it's a general unemployment issue that is at play. If we saw general unemployment rates in Australia come down, we would see youth unemployment rates come down much faster. And indeed, when you pull it apart, what's been happening over the last year or two is that essentially employers have stopped hiring new young people, because if you're an employer, the first thing you do when life gets a bit tricky is stop hiring new people, and that obviously disproportionately affects young people. The second thing you do is lay off existing workers, and we've actually seen relatively little of that. So what we are seeing at the moment in youth unemployment is exactly what you would expect to see given a general downturn in the labour market. That brings us to the question of youth wages, and as I can't remember whether it was Emma or Lucy was pointing out, we already have youth wages in Australia. Pretty much all awards and indeed across the board at the minimum wage level, we have lower minimum wages for people who are younger, and we would suggest that that is a very good idea. If you look at differences in employment rates for young people across the OECD, it is very stark how that is very tightly correlated to whether or not they have youth wages. Countries that make no allowance in terms of their minimum wage for younger people wind up with really high rates of youth unemployment. And yes, somebody who is young has as much rent to pay potentially as someone who is older, but on the other hand, at least if they've got a job, they've got some chance. And the bottom line is that if employers have to pay exactly the same minimum wage to a 16-year-old as they do to a 30-year-old, what that drives them to do is essentially only hire 30-year-olds, and you wind up with really high rates of unemployment amongst young people. You wind up with a generation that then hasn't worked for 4 or 5 years, and then they find it very difficult to get into the labour market. What I think we can agree on is that minimum welfare payments, so particularly around New Start, need to be at a barely adequate level, or at least at a barely adequate level. And if you see a discount, even from the relatively low levels of New Start today for young people, that is going to make their lives particularly difficult. The only other thing I wanted to pick up on was this issue about whether or not life really is getting any better, because that's clearly a big issue. And you're absolutely right to point out that we've seen, obviously, costs as well as incomes go up over the last decade. But what we have seen is real incomes going up. So by definition, that means going up substantially faster than overall inflation. And of course, some things have gone up faster in that basket. We've seen, for example, rents and utility bills go up faster than inflation, but we've seen manufacturing goods go up much more slowly than inflation. Indeed, in some cases, we've seen real deflation. So overall, when we say that real incomes are going up, by definition, what we mean is that incomes are going up faster than costs. And indeed, NatSem has done some very good work showing that the real disposable income of households, even those at the bottom, has tended to go up over the last 10 years. Now, that means that life is getting better. It doesn't mean that life is good enough. And I'd come back and say we do need to worry about those people at the bottom, as I've said, and I think we're all vigorously agreeing on, particularly for those who are unemployed. They clearly face enormous challenges in the way that things are being set up today.
Can I just touch on one thing, Michael? Sorry.
Please.
The VCOSS report also showed that a third of the people who actually fell into the stats as living in poverty actually had a job. So I just thought it was worth picking up on that, because I think it picks up on the casual and precarious nature of employment and underemployment, if you like. So I just thought it was worth mentioning that as well.
We were talking about precarious before in another context. My wife is part of the Queen's Fund, which looks after women who are in difficulty, and one thing I'm noticing is that the difference between coping and crisis can be as simple as your washing machine breaking down and needing $800 to get over that hump. That indicates a very precarious situation, particularly for single mothers. Emma, if we could start with you, do you see that as a looming issue? Are we dealing with it adequately? And if I can just throw in, picking up on the point that John made, in terms of what all this is about, which is life getting better, is life okay? Does that fundamental question have sufficient place in our general political debate?
Yeah, I think one of the things to take into account here is we've got a significantly ageing population, but we've also got an increasing birth rate. So we're seeing it at both ends, if you like. And I think that's one of the parts that hasn't really had as much commentary in the media. And I think a lot of the context that we're being given around the federal budget has really been much more around look at the number, the amount of the population that's ageing, look at the call that's going to have on the purse strings, etc. as well. What we're probably looking at, and I know John, I've heard John speak about this this a number of times, but what we're probably looking at is not so much a budget emergency, but more around some structural issues that we need to look at within our budget and take into account the overall the overall picture of the budget. And one of the key things is that, yes, the population is ageing. Yes, that's going to bring with it a number of considerable demands. But at the same time, we need to look at what's the broader picture look like. So we've got an increasing birth rate. What does that mean in terms of the resources that need to go into that component as well? So I think that we do need a broader discussion in terms of what that means for budget. But at the same time, I would be saying I don't buy in for 1 minute in terms of saying that the budget emergency is the crisis that it is, but I do think there's some structural issues that need to be adjusted within the budget. And ACOSS and VCOSS have been pretty vocal in terms of talking about, we think there's a whole range of measures that could be approached in regard to that. So looking at negative gearing, looking at family trust, looking at a whole host of other things that we could actually look at in terms of how do we structurally set up our economy for where it needs to be heading into the future. And we think that the measures that have been, or the proposed measures that have been put into place at the moment are not the answer.
Which brings us to middle class welfare, corporate welfare, the end of the age of entitlement. I agree and have written about a number of times that we don't have a deficit and debt crisis. That's demonstrably the case. You know, you can show that with OECD figures, but we do have some of these looming issues. Lucy, are you seeing that come through demographically?
We are. So we do know that we've got an acute shortage of affordable housing, and older members of our community are really facing that problem, particularly older women. They're one of the highest groups who are impacted by homelessness, and it is a pretty heartbreaking situation to see an older woman who has always had a reasonably comfortable life, and often because of relationship breakdown has found herself in a position where she's no longer able to afford her housing and is entering into homelessness. So we've got 35,000 people in Victoria on the waiting list for public housing. It's a very long wait. 86 people every day are turned away from homelessness services. So this is an issue that's impacting on older Victorians, and the lack of affordable housing is contributing to that.
Michaela, are you concerned about the ageing of the population in the context of poverty and the budget?
There are a few sort of intersecting issues that occur to my mind. Sort of thinking about the sort of long-term trends, obviously, average age expectancy has been incessantly on the rise, and we'd probably expect it, other things being equal, to be continually on the rise. I mean, the next cohort of older Australians now sort of coming through, they're sort of the fittest, most educated older Australians that you'll sort of find gracing this continent, and so in that respect I think life will be quite good for them. There are some issues obviously surrounding the operationality of compulsory superannuation. There's obviously a concern that the compulsory super scheme, the amounts of funds generated through that may not be sufficient to hold people over through their retiring years as they are ageing and as life expectancy so comes through. That's very much a live issue in the political debate, as people are aware. Health costs as well is another issue, because health is demographically sensitive, particularly those people in the last sort of 6 months or sort of 12 months of their life tend to more intensively use sort of healthcare services. But if I may, I just want to touch very briefly on the budget issue. I think from my perspective it is clear that there's a budget problem in terms of the aggregate, in terms of the deficit, in terms of debt, in terms of sort of the structural issues as well. The federal budget in particular is basically a give and take redistributional sort of budget. There's not many sort of productive sort of spending elements within the budget, and how that links to the ageing issue is this, that deficit and debt today represents future tax liability commitments tomorrow. So as much as we might worry about the position of older Australians, I also want to have a bit of a think about Generation Y as well, because if the spending overload, from my perspective, is not dealt with, they're going to be feeling the pinch of much higher sort of tax penalties, which has disincentives for work, and all that sort of poverty hedging that we're talking about now.
John?
Well, I think it raises a whole series of issues. Some of them are around the sustainability of both the economy and the budget. And there I think it's worth remembering that the population actually ages very slowly. And you don't need particularly big changes in the participation rates of, say, 65-year-olds to see no material change in the total participation rate. So the number of people working divided by the total population may well not wind up changing over the next 40 or 50 years, so long as we see some increase in the number of particularly 65-year-olds, 70-year-olds who work. And that's indeed why moving the pension age up to 70 is such a large and important reform, because it's an enormous lever around both economic and budgetary sustainability. The second thing that it does raise is concern around the sustainability of the budget, particularly as more and more people qualify for pensions. One of the problems we've got is that eligibility for the old age pension is ridiculously broad. It is very difficult if you have a competent financial planner not to qualify for the old age pension. Middle class welfare, despite what you hear, is actually a relatively small problem in Australia. If you are under the age of 65, it is very difficult to be middle class and actually qualify for material welfare. If, on the other hand, you are over the age of 65, middle class welfare is alive and well. There are a large number of 65-year-old plus households who are doing quite well, who nevertheless qualify for material part pensions. And obviously that has a material cost to the budget. And if you're looking for somewhere in the welfare budget to save some money so that your budget balances, I would suggest that that is an extremely good place to start. The next issue that it does raise is for these households, particularly single women who wind up not in the house that they've lived in, and what's their situation. And this is where I'd absolutely agree with Michaela that one of the biggest issues here is around land use regulation. What we've done in most of Australia's big cities, particularly Melbourne and Sydney, is essentially lock up the middle ring. I'm talking about Camberwell. Places like that, which are close enough to the city that they have very good infrastructure and good access to all the things you care about, and by and large, relatively large block sizes, and then planning use regulations that make it very difficult in practice to subdivide that land. Now, that's terrific for the people who already own houses in Camberwell, but it's a real problem for people who don't. And ironically, it's most of all a problem for households that wind up with quite radically changed circumstances. Maybe one partner dies, all of a sudden the household's got no income for whatever reason, they didn't own the house. And then it's very difficult to acquire a new house which is smaller in those areas. Firstly, there's actually very little of such housing stock available. And secondly, because we don't allow much subdivision in those areas, it tends to be extremely expensive. So if you are looking for a reform which will have a really big impact on distribution and availability of housing for people on low incomes, I would suggest don't start looking at building social housing. Don't start by looking at how much the government provides in terms of housing assistance. Start by looking at the planning system and the ease or otherwise with which you can subdivide particularly these middle ring areas of Melbourne, where there's clearly a lot of land, an awful lot of space, many people who will be prepared to subdivide their houses because frankly they can make some money doing it, but it's very difficult given our planning legislation to do so. And of course that also has the advantage that it provides relatively low cost accommodation where people physically are used to living. Most people want to age in place. They want to grow old, the place that they've been living for the last 30 or 40 years. And again, if we really restrict subdivision, then we make it very difficult for that to happen.
And we've just done that, haven't we, with the planning changes in Victoria. The barbecue belt councils that you're talking about are locking up to 83, 84, 85% of the land. That's a conversation that's been had elsewhere and will continue. Are there any questions out here?
James Bennett from the Tenants Union of Victoria.
Thanks,
we
James.
obviously have a big interest in housing across the board, but I suppose a question in relation to the private rental market. We know that more people are renting for longer, there's more families, and basically, I guess, security of tenure in that situation becomes very important. But perhaps an open question to the panel at either a micro or a macro level. what could be done to improve the private rental market? And John, I'm perhaps interested, you've touched on planning, but negative gearing is obviously a very vexed question perhaps. And Lucy, perhaps to you on the more micro level, just around sort of notices to vacate. Any comments there?
John?
If I can start. Well, as I suggested, if I was only allowed to do one thing, I'd work on the planning legislation first, because the fundamental driver here is around supply. Demand is whatever it is, that's how many people we've got, and it's planning regulations that ultimately are the biggest problem with supply. As people have been pointing out, you can actually build a house for not very much. It's the cost of the land that's causing problems, and that's because we don't allow people to subdivide it much. In terms of negative gearing, that cannot possibly be helping. Essentially what negative gearing does at the margins is make it more attractive for somebody to own a house to rent it rather than own it to live in it. And I think the tough question for negative gearing policy is to ask, this is effectively a tax concession. It means that some people who arrange their affairs in a particular way wind up paying materially less tax than essentially everyone else in terms of income tax. And the question is, why do we provide that tax concession to them? Now, the conventional answer was it results in lots more housing being built. We now know that that's just simply not true. Only about 5% of negatively geared houses are houses that are newly constructed. So it's not helping very much. The cost of it is very material, and I think it's fair enough to say, look, this is a policy that's providing a very substantial tax concession. There doesn't appear to be any particularly strong policy rationale for it. If anything, it's probably pushing things in the wrong direction because at the margin it pushes houses into being owned by investors rather than occupiers. And therefore, if we can both push social policy in the right direction and have a bit more money to just play with in the budget, that sounds like a pretty good idea.
Thanks, James. So from an eviction perspective, I think as I've mentioned, in Victoria it is very easy to be evicted from private rental properties, and what we're talking about for low-income people is if you're evicted from your private rental property in the current housing environment where there's an acute shortage of other affordable housing, there is a very real prospect that you will be homeless. So I think what we need to be thinking about in terms of policy levers and legislative change is making eviction of vulnerable people a last resort. And there are a variety of ways we can do it. There needs to be a focus on early intervention. So with our Women's Homelessness Prevention Project, since April we've assisted nearly 30 women. 80% of them are facing eviction for falling behind in their rent, and 80% of those evictions have been preventable. But without that early intervention of legal representation and social work support, it's highly likely those evictions would have gone ahead. So there are things that can be done from a policy perspective. People need to have links to supports. They need to have access to brokerage like the Queen's Fund that Michael mentioned, where you can just get a short injection of the income that you don't otherwise have to get you over the line to be able to sustain your housing. From a legislative point of view, there certainly can be protections built into the Residential Tenancies Act that make us think twice before the evictions go ahead. Some of that would be changing the considerations that VCAT, the Victorian Civil and Administrative Tribunal, the things they have to take into account before making that order that a tenancy is to end. So they're some of the things that I think we should be thinking about to try and keep people in private rental, knowing that if they're evicted, there will be a very, very, very long wait for public housing, and that homelessness services are really overwhelmed with demand.
Michaela, can you pick up on the question of negative gearing per se? Do you think it's a good idea?
Sorry, what was that?
Can you pick up on the issue of negative gearing per se? Do you think that that's a useful idea?
I'm actually sort of quite agnostic about that issue, but I'm far more passionate about liberalising sort of land supply for the reasons that sort of John has given. I think it's an absolute policy imperative to liberalise zoning and planning sort of development regulations and like to actually build many more rental properties. And that, other things being equal, will obviously increase the supply and tend to lower the sort of real cost of rental housing over time, and so that way lower income people more easily sort of access That would be the main issue for me.
And that's fundamentally about having the right to exercise your property rights in a flexible way, rather than being told how you can construct on your land.
Oh, I mean, certainly, but it's really about making sure that our sort of housing market's really fit for purpose. I think it's quite a tragedy that there is sort of quite severe limitations on the ability of developers to sort of build more housing because of things like urban growth limits and the like. I mean, you get rid of large swathes of those sorts of things. And one of the greatest hedges against poverty is having a roof over your head. And I think this should be one of the most paramount reforms that should be embarked upon.
Emma, do you want to talk quickly to James's question?
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on probably something that each of the panel members has picked up, and that is that, you know, one of the key things we've seen is the notion of affordable housing and people moving out to the growth corridors to access what looks like affordable housing but actually isn't affordable housing at all. So they're often moved away from family, friends, etc. There isn't public transport, there's not health services nearby, there's not basic community services nearby. So I think one of the challenges in the current climate is there's often discussions around what's affordable housing. We know that there is a significant we've got a significant shortage of rental properties that are genuinely affordable, that are safe, that are appropriate, etc. as well. And one of the biggest areas of growth that we've seen is in the growth corridors where when the services aren't there.
Can I just add? I mean, I think that's one of the issues with hoping that you can solve this problem simply by relaxing the controls on the urban growth boundary, because as you're pointing out, those houses are often in fact not very affordable in reality to live in, and one of the real problems is that people move into them often not quite understanding just how high many of those costs will be and just how poor the infrastructure is around them, and it's why this issue around the middle ring is so important. I think it's also one of those things where there are countervailing interests here. I mean, the bottom line is not many people who are living in a one-storey house appreciate having a 15-storey apartment suddenly go up next to them. And I think one of the problems is that we've struggled to find a middle road that says, look, if you want to put 2, maybe 3 stories up next to someone in Camberwell, that's something that we should essentially be encouraging. If you want, as of right, to put 15 stories up in Camberwell wherever you like, well, maybe there's a lot more reasons why that's not such a great idea. And of course, the reality is that you can create an awful lot of housing. And I don't mean to just pick on Camberwell, I'm happy to pick on Essendon and lots of other places too. You can create an awful lot of housing by converting many of those areas into essentially subdividing them often into 2 or 3, if you like, blocks, and then moving up 2 stories.
Ken Harris, I'm interested in your comments on overseas money that's going into residential property. There was a case recently in Glen Waverley where they sold 250 new units off the plan in one night, and 249 went to Chinese people. And I've got no doubt that the majority of this money is coming in from China.
My response will be so. We want actually international capital and indeed labour mobility. So I would essentially welcome it, while realising, of course, that we have quite extensive supply problems, right? So I don't have any problem with it at all. They're welcome here.
Lucy, do you think that it matters who owns the property rather than who is the resident?
No, look, our main concern is with who is the tenant in the property and what their protections are and their ability to have a safe and secure roof over their head.
Hi, my name's Peter Sloan. At the beginning of the talk, you stated that this wasn't a question of right and left. I wonder whether it's sometimes couched as a question of right and wrong. And I just wonder how much the degree which we blame the poor and the homeless for some sort of moral failure actually completely clouds our way of thinking, and whether people who are extremely rich, like Twiggy Forrest, seem to have some sort of moral superiority which they seek to foist on the less well-off in society.
It's a great question, fascinating question. The moral high ground is a very lonely place, isn't it? Do you think that the poor are being blamed? If we start
Yeah, I do to some degree. And I think one of the challenges we often have for people that suddenly find themselves in really difficult situations is that they can be very reluctant to ask for help in the first place because they feel embarrassed. They'd actually never contemplated that they'd be in that circumstance. And a number of our frontline agencies tell us that, the people who are turning up saying, I never thought I'd be like this. I never thought it would be me asking to need help, but actually I've lost my job, or my partner's sick, or I've been a victim of domestic violence. I actually didn't think this could happen to me. So I think it's one of the challenges, and it's one of the challenges, to be frank, that we have as an organisation at VCOSS and that others do as well, is how do we broaden this out to a debate where we can have people engage and genuinely have a good discussion about what might some of the solutions look like, because I think that people are a little bit afraid of it and don't want to look like this might be me. The other part I would say is also how do we enable people who are in very difficult financial situations and other situations to actually to deal with dignity. And I think one of the things that you touched on earlier, Michael, and one of the fantastic examples is Good Shepherd microfinance, where people suddenly have a life circumstance where suddenly, a washing machine has broken down, etc. They can go to someone who can actually loan them money that's not an outrageous payday lender that's going to charge them an extraordinary rate of interest, but help them get life back on track. But it's being able to get in fast where you can actually get life back on track rather than have things continue to deteriorate.
Lucy?
Yeah, it's an issue I'm very interested in, and did look into it in my research overseas, and particularly in the context of enforcement-based approaches to homelessness and use of public space. For example, people begging. And what I did find was that there were two main reasons why we turned to the criminal justice system and to law enforcement to deal with those problems. One was because we just didn't know what else to do, and that was our first resort. And two is because of a lot of pressure on decision makers from members of the community, particularly in gentrifying communities where they were really uncomfortable with that very visible hardship and I guess, acute display of poverty in their communities, and they essentially wanted it to go away. They didn't know how to cope with it day to day, and they thought that kind of a crackdown or a law enforcement based approach would be the solution. What we obviously see is that's a really expensive way of going about things. It's also really ineffective, and of course, and most importantly, it imposes further hardship on people who are already doing it really tough. So I think that is one of our biggest challenges, is changing community attitudes and increasing understanding about who experiences poverty and why, and that will really open the door to a better conversation and better thought out policies in terms of how we respond.
I think that's a great question, and thank you for asking it, Peter, I think it is. Look, I mean, I would actually sort of, I would tend to agree with you. I don't think that it's reasonable to basically be laying the sort of blame on the poor themselves, essentially for many sort of policy sort of reasons that lock people into a state of poverty and relative disadvantage. Then I guess from my sort of philosophical perspective as a sort of classical liberal, I mean, from the time of Adam Smith, who was the father of modern economics, right through today, classical liberals have always sort of talked about the paramount importance of having greater economic and social freedom as a way to emancipate the poor. If anything else, I mean, Adam Smith's book, The Wealth of Nations, was a critique against crony capitalism, which is something I would definitely criticise, to the extent that a rich person obtains riches through backdoor dealings with government is something I would thoroughly disapprove of. The way to sort of earn wealth, and this applies to everyone, is to be able to genuinely serve the needs of other people by providing a useful good or service voluntaristically and in a mutually sort of beneficial fashion. So from my lens, I'm quite passionate about enriching the poor so that they themselves can enjoy sort of wealth and comfort that have been enjoyed by the rich today. And I think that can best be achieved in a situation where there's a lot more sort of economic freedom, so sort of smaller, less intrusive government, get it out of the way. And so, basically people can find their own creative, enterprising ways to improving themselves and other people.
John, do you want to pick up on
Yeah,
blame?
I'd love, yes. I think this is a really interesting question about whether there are attitudes about blaming the poor. And I suspect it's very difficult to explain what is being proposed, for example, around unemployment benefits, particularly for youth, without that attitude lying behind it. It seems to be, my aunt knows somebody who's got a cousin whose child is kind of sitting on the sofa not doing anything, seems to be what lies behind it, rather than the hard, cold analysis, which is very clear that we're seeing an increase in youth unemployment, not because there's an increase in people sitting on the sofa out of choice, but because the economy slowed, read the paper kind of thing. So I think that there really is an issue around blaming the poor that lies behind it. The question, of course, is what can we do about that, apart from calling it, and I think it's important to call it. One thing you can do is there's some good work that's been done, particularly out of the Hilda survey, showing just how many Australian households at some point over the 12 years that Hilda's been running have wound up using unemployment benefits. I can't remember the number, but it's actually very large. We have a social welfare safety net. We call it a safety net for a really good reason, which is that it really does help people when they get into trouble, and a surprisingly large number of Australian households use it at some stage. And I think it's important to talk about that and for that to be recognised. I think the other issue is that it's also important to do what we can to encourage our suburbs to be what you might describe as mixed rather than uniform. And particularly in Sydney and Melbourne, we've wound up with remarkably uniform suburbs. And you can draw maps of Melbourne and Sydney now, as my colleague Jane Francis Kelly has done, which are really stark. Essentially, middle and inner ring Melbourne is rich, well-educated, very well-educated, and doing very nicely with high access to jobs and high levels of employment. Outer suburban Melbourne is poor, by and large much less educated, much more unemployment, and essentially struggling on pretty much every other measure you look at. And that again comes back to planning policy. Why does it look like that? Because essentially people who cannot afford to buy anywhere else can afford to buy on the edge. Why is it they can only afford to buy on the edge? And the answer is because we have restricted the sale of land so tightly and the subdivision of land so tightly in the middle and middle rings. And that's what we need to have a long, hard look at if we're to see our suburbs more mixed. And when it's the person next door, it's much harder to blame them. It's much easier to actually know the full story of what's happened, much easier to know, look, stuff happened, it wasn't anything they did, and then to start showing some empathy for the situation that they're in. And I think anything we can do that results in our suburbs being genuinely more mixed like that is something that's to be encouraged.
We're almost out of time. In fact, we are, and I think it's such a critical point to come out towards the end, empathy, which leads to compassion and enlightened self-interest and good policy. I did say there's a final question down the front. Would you like to ask it before we wrap up?
Thanks. David Sweating from Save the Children. I just want to touch on your point about unlocking land for affordable housing. And I'm wondering if the panel had any thoughts or comments around the actual production of new sites, new development sites. So we're seeing sort of small to medium-sized development now happening in pockets of Melbourne, and some provisions for low income in terms of price. But then those units, apartments are being snapped up by those who don't actually need those low-income housing opportunities. So I was wondering if the panel had any thoughts around how to change certain provisions within the planning rules to make those low-income houses more accessible, because they are out there, but there's not many. Could I
thank you for the question. Could I invite the panel to answer that one briefly, and also just to wrap up, perhaps the magic wand question. If there's one thing that you could do, I mean, John's indicated already, but if you want to touch on that question, and also your magic wand.
Okay, to touch on that question, I think one of the key things in the developments that are taking place is to look at the mix. We've seen some that have a mix of social housing alongside other types of housing, and I think we would like to see, one of the key things that VCOSS would like to see is a greater growth around social housing where there are new developments taking place. We think that that would make a difference. I take on board some of the other comments that have been made, but where there are new developments taking place, and we think sometimes developers have significant financial advantages, that they could be putting some of that back into communities and creating social housing opportunities as well. My one magic wand, that's actually a bit hard, Michael. You put me on the spot about that one. I haven't had time to think while everyone else is responding as well. One of the challenges we have at VCOSS is because we cover such a broad mix of things. I guess for me it's early intervention is the key. So no matter what it comes to, as I said, with education, health, housing, etc., early intervention is the key because we want to get in early and get people on the right track.
Thank you, Emma. Lucy.
I support Emma's comments around the increase in social housing, including inclusionary zoning for new developments. In terms of the magic wand, I think ours is obviously we need to be doing what we can to keep people in housing. So that involves early intervention. It may involve legal representation. It involves the other range of supports people need to get back on track. But once people are slipping into homelessness, the range of ramifications for their own well-being and the well-being of their kids is so acute that it really, eviction at this point needs to be an absolute last resort.
In terms of the specific issue you raised, I'll need to probably think about it a little more, except to say that if there's a problem of accessibility for low-income people, then there's obviously some sort of imperative to try to sort of build more. I guess I wouldn't try to sort of lock people, regardless of where they are on the income spectrum, from accessing what they want. So I think perhaps a supply side resolution could be in order. In terms of sort of the final resolution, so to speak, I'd sort of encourage people to take the long view, the very sort of long view, and to recognise that the great enrichment or the sort of erosion of extreme levels of poverty have most successfully taken place in locations around the world in which there have been a sort of a greater unleashing of basically sort of market entrepreneurial sort of forces. You can think about the Western world over the past 200 years. We can think more interestingly, more contemporaneously about China since 1978, a radical reduction in poverty in that country once it's been embraced into the world economy, once it's introduced some reforms which provide sort of security for market-based activities. For the domestic economy, I do worry about our sort of growth projections over the next few years. We're probably going to have a few sluggish years in terms of economic growth following the last few. So my resolution is not really to lean towards politics. It's really about liberalise, depoliticise, and that will be, I think, the resolution.
Thanks, Michaela. John?
In terms of the very specific question around mandating social housing as part of developments, I think you need to be careful about that. Property development is profitable. You want it to be profitable, otherwise nobody does it. That would be the worst of all possible worlds. And I suspect that the answer is more around ensuring that you can't use the planning regime to prevent that, or at least the planning regime doesn't discourage the building of social housing in places where people are prepared to rent it and essentially generate a profit for whoever's developed it. To go to your question, Michael, about what's the magic bullet here, I suspect, as with most policy questions, ultimately we need to worry about all of these levers. We need to worry about the adequacy of New Start. We need to worry about education levels, particularly for those coming from less advantaged backgrounds. We need to worry about how we are pushing people out of housing when they get under stress. We need to worry about preserving and improving our institutions that encourage enterprise and encourage people to develop support and solutions and products for people who are in poverty. And we need to look at the planning regime, and all of these things contribute, all of them make a difference. They're certainly some of the bigger levers, but I suspect if we really want to make a difference to poverty in Victoria, we would have a good hard look at all of them.
And I think all of that, just to wrap up, comes under that rubric, doesn't it, of equality of opportunity and creating opportunity. And to go to one of the questions we had earlier and touching on what I was saying at the start, I don't think it is a question of left and right, it's a question of right and wrong, and perhaps one way of seeing leadership, because a lot of leadership that we're talking about is coming from the ground up, from the community, rather than from the top down. And one way of looking at leadership in all of those perspectives is perhaps one way of seeing leadership is it's the question, it's asking the question, is this right? And if there's a gap between what is the case and what ought to be the case, then we should all be activists. And when right is what is the case, then I guess we should all be trying to be conservative of that area, which goes back to the ideology thing. Thank you all for being here at the opening event of Anti-Poverty Week here in Victoria. I'd like to thank our panellists again, Emma King from VCOSS, Lucy Adams from Justice Connect, Michaela Novak from the IPA, and John Daley from the Grattan Institute. I've been fascinated and appreciative of what you've had to say. Thank you to Anti-Poverty Week Victoria's committee for organising today's event, which will be up on YouTube, and we'll let everybody know when that is available and we'll send it out. And finally, thank you very much to the City of Melbourne for their Knowledge Melbourne program. Thank you again, everybody. Go well, have a good day, have a very good week.